So Dominique, thanks very much indeed for joining me. So you've got an incredible track history working for a variety of different governance bodies, from the GSMA to ITU, is that right? The ITU. But tell me a little bit more about China and China's involvement in the technology industry. Let's put it broadly like that. To what extent would you say that, Chinese technology companies and the Chinese Communist Party are one and the same thing?
It's been my experience that they have quite a cozy and close relationship. So we don't have any hard evidence yet, but I think that they're in close contact with each other.
So I think I get the point. Now, obviously, there's been a huge debate in the United Kingdom over the last few years about the involvement of Huawei in the 5G core infrastructure, and it's therefore shining a very bright light really on the supply chain and Chinese components and also Chinese hardware in the broader technology supply chain, not just in 5G, but in a whole host of other areas, which are very strategically important in terms of intellectual property and state assets and infrastructure. But when we were chatting earlier, you mentioned to me that the US is a bit further ahead in terms of getting some of this Chinese componentry in the broadest sense out of the US network and the US supply chain, right back to 2012 when Obama was president. What do you think the challenges are therefore for the UK now, really to sort out our supply chain and our overdependence on China?
Yeah, so the U.S. made a decision not to have Chinese equipment companies in Huawei and ZTE and those back in 2012 build out their what would be probably 3G, 4G networks and LTE, and obviously the knock-on effect is that there's no equipment and no equipment in the 5G space, and so therefore it's easier for them to do what Trump administration has done and do a wholesale ban. The UK has a very close relationship with companies like Huawei through the work that they've done with them. And you can follow some of the history of it on the National Cybersecurity Center website. But basically, there was a lab and, there was a lot of assessments done on an annual basis and talking about what part of the components or the network components that would be in a number of the networks perhaps had some issues, software bugs, hardware bugs, things like that. So the deployment through all of the networks, with the exception of O2, by the way, basically of all of this hardware is already integrated, right? And as we know with the supply chain, you've got the biggest issue now, and the issue that we'll talk about in a little bit probably is the chips, right? The manufacturing of the chips and the guarantee of that. But we have in the UK most of the hardware, not all of it, but most of it on the edge. But there's quite a lot of it deployed, right? So it's going to take some time, as we heard in the news, to get rid of that. But then also, we don't know further on what other components have perhaps, a component of the chip that's been made in another device, et cetera, made in China.
Yeah.
I think also you're going to see in the longer term strategy, for all companies like Apple, for example, I think you'll start seeing a lot more manufacturing go on in other countries. I know I think they're building a manufacturing plant in Texas, I believe. Yeah. So you're going to see probably 10, 20 years out where that's happening, where they can get more guarantee of certainty of rule of law, for example, and the economy and taxation, all the things that you need when you're in manufacturing.
Now, one of the other things that China does very effectively is it can, just given the might and the amount of resources it can throw at it, it can get heavily involved in some of the standards bodies, and obviously having those that stamp of authority, being standards compliant, but through ISO or whoever, is a big deal for them. Do you sense that they, actively try to manipulate things for their own advantage?
Yeah, for sure. So what's interesting about Chinese companies and the Chinese government participating in multilateral bodies like the ITU, ISO, and IEC, apologies for all the acronyms, but internationally recognized standards organizations that have a history, is that they try to standardize very specific things. So there's a long history of many companies globally trying to standardize their products, right, in standards bodies. That's well known. But now we've got an influx, a particularly high influx of work items and proposals for work items from China and Chinese companies that are so specific that would, obviously relate to certain devices that are being manufactured, let's say, or things like that. So rather than having a framework or a process that's quite top level as a standard process, like we typically see, for example, for the internet and different internet protocols, China's bringing in really specific issues. And there's a lot to be said for the fact that their vision of standards and governance of standards reflects their political ideology in their country.
Industry. And is it particular standards bodies they're particularly active in, that where it's clear that it's to their clear strategic advantage to be active in those particular standards bodies?
Yeah, sure. So, so they're active in the main 5G standards body, which is 3GPP, and that's from a tactical point of view because everybody's active in that, right? All the companies that want to play a role, ecosystem companies, everybody. Mm-hmm. But then when it comes to multilateral organizations, they tend to be more active because the West, the UK, the US, et cetera, Canada, the Western countries, upon the advent of liberalization in the late 80s, allowed the market and industry to take the lead. And because industry was leading on standards, right, they went to bodies that would let industry do that in a very multi-stakeholder way. Whereas, so that meant the ITU and other international bodies that are multilateral saw fewer and fewer companies coming. Not to say they aren't there, but there is a vacuum, and China's really taken advantage of that because effectively ISO, IEC, and ITU are a part and party to the digital agreement, which I believe is TTIP at the WTO, and enables the trade if those standards become, if the work becomes a standard in those bodies, the trade agreement at the WTO enables the trade of those particular items that have those standards in them. Mm-hmm. It's a smart move, and it's something, every country does for all types of things, but in particular, when you look at technology, you really see it overly assertive from China. So.
And what was the kind of tipping point, as far as you're concerned, about in terms of the recent decision or the recent U-turn over 5G? Was it NCSC sort of saying, well, this has to happen? Was it about the trade negotiations between the United Kingdom and the United States? Was it what was it? What was the sort of geopolitical tipping point that resulted in the change of direction, do you think?
Well, I think it's more technical. There have been ongoing discussions between the U.S. and UK for many years about this. Many years since the Trump administration began. It's been quite a hot topic, and many meetings and Zoom meetings, I'm sure. But basically, if you look at the National Cybersecurity Center website, there's quite a long blog post about why they changed their mind from a technical point of view. And basically, it says they could no longer guarantee the security and resilience of the chips for the network. And that has to do with, again, supply chain, right? Yeah. So because of the US basically sanctioning and blocking all Chinese companies, quite big ones and little ones, which are not making the headlines as much, that means different components will have to be sourced for chips from Huawei. They can no longer, source certain things and use certain types of supply chain elements that they've been using before. So there's no longer a guarantee on that. And there's no way to know how, right at this moment, how Huawei is going to change their chip design, chip development, et cetera. So that was the decision. But I'm sure there's a lot of political room wrangling that we don't know about.
Does it mean, though, that in order to plug that supply chain gap, that we are now, and I say we, meaning the West, are now in a position where we really do actively need to start looking at the creation of chip fabrication facilities and upping the ante in terms of intellectual property development in semiconductors as well? So does it come down to the wire, or is that pretty much technology that is easily replaceable in terms of what we have readily developed?
I think you're absolutely right. I think we do have to start thinking about manufacturing and really kind of being competitive from a hardware point of view. If you look at, why are we having this issue? Well, we only have Nokia, Ericsson, and Huawei able to deploy hardware devices for 5G, right? Because hardware is difficult. You have to have a factory, you have to have manufacturing, you have to, again, have the different components of the supply chain, and you have to guarantee security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's easier to become a startup in software or an app developer, right? And so I think Vodafone, for example, has joined a coalition with other companies like AT&T called the Open RAN initiative, which allows open source software to develop on any box, any hardware for 5G. And that's going to be great, but it's only one part of the story. I think we really need to do investment and think about how to get venture funds on actual physical manufacturing of hardware for the future, for our network components and our communications.
But my final question for you really is the kind of overarching vision that China has regarding the internet and the provenance of the internet and even such things as domain name strategies. I would imagine that, given the fact that the domain conventions and the authorities are highly US centric, that China would want to wrest control and maybe create two intranets. Is that kind of their ambition? And what are they doing in terms of governance of the internet as a whole, rather than just the provision of 5G and data services?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Huawei has developed some research that's starting to be sort of submitted to a number of standards organizations on creating an identifier focused internet rather than the best effort internet that we have now, which is built on older technology but works really well. And we've seen that because we're all working from home or taking gym classes at home or shopping online or watching Netflix, right? We've all seen how well and resilient the internet has been working in the last 3 to 6 months, with over 30% more traffic than it's ever had. But the idea China's using language saying, China and Huawei in particular, like, oh, we need to have guaranteed quality of service and security and all these things. And they're looking to kind of create a very top-down, very static type of internet technology that reflects, again, their politics, their political ideology, rather than a sort of spontaneous multi-stakeholder kind of approach. Again, we do have networks that are identifier focused rather than IP address, right? Your internet protocol address focused. And that's a way that a lot of companies manage sort of cloud networks or networks on the edge connecting to the internet. But the core and the backbone is like that. Now, arguably, China has its own internet anyway, right? In terms of different technologies being deployed within the country of China. But I don't know about you, but every time I have a meeting with colleagues from all over the world, the Chinese always get the worst network connection. So that's purely anecdotal, but it's been quite consistent in the last few months. So.
Well, yeah, it's quite it's interesting in that the command approach, the approach to the internet is like their approach pretty much to every other aspect of
yes.
corruption, in which to be state controlled and mandated. So Listen, Dominique, it's been absolutely fascinating. I do really appreciate your time, and we will have a couple of other speakers, as I mentioned, touching on this topic. But listen, the debate is going to continue, and I really appreciate you taking part. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.